Welcome to Assembly Calendar. I'm Mike Friesen. With us for our program today, Assemblyman Bob Oaks. Bob Oaks represents the 130th Assembly District in New York State. That's an Assembly District that includes the counties of Wayne, Oswego, and Cayuga. And we want to thank you folks all across the region for joining us for our program today. Bob Oaks, nice to see you.
Nice to be here, Mike.
We're going to get caught up with you on what's happening with those rising waters of Lake Ontario and what New York State, how New York State is helping out the people that are impacted by those rising waters. We've got a couple other things to talk about too as this 2017 session is winding down to a close here at the state capitol. We start though with a new push by you and some of your colleagues in the Assembly's Minority Conference to open up, I suppose is the best way to say it, open up the secrecy and some of the corruption that seems to be swirling around some of the ways New York State spends its money.
Well, absolutely, Mike. We've seen in New York State a number of legislators in past years and within the last year at the highest levels of government within the executive branch, people benefiting themselves by trying to use their power, their influence over state resources and how they direct those resources. And so we've seen indictments and convictions at the legislative level. We have looked at right now the indictments within the executive branch and looking at some of those cases coming up. So all of those things, when you see that, we know that the way to try to make this work better for the taxpayers and controlling their dollars and having some sense that they know their dollars are being spent for the right and correct purposes is to have more oversight over that. And so we've put together legislation in the midst of the end of this session and saying, before we leave Albany, we need to do several things that would make that control stronger and protective for the taxpayers of New York.
It's kind of an alternative view of things from what the governor said a couple weeks ago when the state budget negotiations was over. I think he made a comment along the lines of, well, that pretty much does it for session. Everybody can go home now. There's nothing more to do here. You say there's something more to do.
Absolutely.
All right, let's look at some comments you made at a press conference in which you unveiled this, what they like to call here in Albany parlance, this omnibus bill. It takes into a lot of different ideas and techniques and unveiled it, if you will, for the public and the people of New York State to see what you're talking about. And then we'll be back to talk more today with Assemblyman Bob Oaks.
It was just about a year ago that we stood here with legislation that our conference crafted to try to respond to the challenges that we saw happening in this state of not enough oversight, not enough transparency in how our dollars are being spent. So our bill is comprehensive. It would make a big difference, and we need to pass this economic development oversight and transparency measures actually this year before the end of session. Thank you.
See, I think of the bidding process itself as an open, fair process, but apparently people have found a way around it and to take advantage of it?
Well, a lot of our economic development programs, decisions are being made. Apparently people are making applications and sending. We have regional councils and whatever, but the ultimate decision being made in Albany, not exactly sure who's making the decisions. And what we found out was decisions were being made by individuals within the Cuomo administration directing those dollars and people benefiting from that. So that's the type of thing. What we would see is those types of dollars, pots of money that are not determined where they're going in the budget, that there would be oversight of those dollars. The comptroller, the attorney general, and the director of the division of the budget would have to sign off on those things so we aren't seeing those dollars being spent, in essence, under the table and directed somewhere, but out in the open. Transparency, openness, that's what we're talking about.
As you said, there are a number of people who are facing indictment right now. Some of the governor's top aides and people connected with that big Buffalo Billions project, which is nothing more than a big economic development program for Western New York, I guess for some of those very reasons, right?
Absolutely. And so we need to, as a state, look, it's the taxpayers' dollars. It's
That's
not,
the thing. That's
it's
the
not
thing
the
right
governor's dollars. It's not the legislators' dollars. This is us being caretakers of tax dollars. We need to make sure that those dollars are invested, they're utilized appropriately and openly.
Yeah, it's one thing when you write out the tax check every April 15th and you send it off, and you're kind of hoping that it's being put towards good use. But I think there's always that question, and when you see indictments and corruption and those things, and that the money that you're sending could actually be going into someone's pocket rather than for the greater good of the state or to provide some kind of service. That's not right.
It's not.
That is not it. All right. So let's turn now to Lake Ontario and what's going on there. It's been a tough spring for some of the people living along the shores of the lake.
Absolutely, and the bays and inlets off Lake Ontario. Lake Ontario hit its record high in mid-May. We've been at or near it since that time, and every storm that comes today, there's weather forecasts for higher winds. People brace because they know that more erosion, more damage could happen, and so it's been a difficult time. The state has responded in certain ways. The governor today is in Sodas Point talking about some of the efforts that we're doing in the state and trying to respond. But this is something, Mike, that isn't over yet. It's a disaster that's been ongoing now for a couple months. And the lake is not going down like this. It's staying maybe down just a little bit. We still don't know the end answer for how bad this is going to be.
I said at the top of the show that there's actually something New York State is doing to help. You can't stop Mother Nature herself, but you can provide some assistance to those people who are being impacted. Tell us a little bit about the bill that came up before the legislature this past week.
Yes, what we're doing within that is there were monies passed within the budget for emergency water, wastewater protection, and drinking water protection, but those dollars weren't going to be available until later in the year. And what this bill did was actually make it so those emergency dollars could be available right now. So if municipalities have a problem, very honestly, one of the things that the governor's talking about today in Sodas Point, they have a sewer pump station that's low, that the water is threatening to wipe out a whole area that is served by that pump station. They're doing some things would provide some emergency services to protect that and make it so that the higher water would not be susceptible to that high water. And so that's one of the types of things that those dollars would exactly be used for.
All right, let's go to the Assembly chamber when that bill came up for discussion, see what Assemblyman Bob Oaks had to say.
Thank the sponsor of this legislation, Mr. Morelli, and just working cooperatively. There is an ongoing challenge that we have with many communities along Lake Ontario. It's bays and inlets suffering from high water and continuing to be a challenge. This bill just would release funds that are currently a part of the budget we just passed but weren't available immediately. This would allow communities suffering today to be able to apply for those resources to respond to those needs. So I will be casting my vote in the positive and encourage everyone to do the same. Thank you.
I think back to some of our earlier discussions on this and that change in the international agreement between the United States and Canada, which allowed for this change this year in the water levels. Now, there's been a lot of rain. There's nothing you can do about that, but there's also a way to adjust and deal with high levels of rain coming into Lake Ontario so that the water levels on the shores aren't affected as badly. A change this year, and there's a lot of people questioning whether or not that change was the right thing to do. Is there going to be any discussion about maybe looking back at the way it was and maybe changing the new agreement to something different?
You're talking about Plan 2014, and Exactly, that's what, I oppose that plan because it said, here's where we've managed the lake within here, this level over the last 50 years. We're looking to let it go higher in some years and lower in others. The first year of that change, we get flood type conditions that it was in a cyclical nature. Every 20, 25 years, we get that. So this is the year we got it, but the plan that is in may not have caused it, but the plan doesn't help us deal with it. And so what I think is we need a definite look back at that plan and to make the South Shore property owners, all those homeowners and property owners in New York State that are being affected by this today, they're going to be affected in other years. We need to look at that plan seriously, and I would hope both at the federal level and at the state level, we would have Plan 2014 changed.
In our remaining few minutes here, let's get an update on an issue we really haven't talked about much in recent years, for that matter, and that's the Ginna nuclear power plant. Its future. There's been proposals to close several of the nuclear power plants scattered across New York State, the Fitzpatrick plant being one of them. What's going on with Ginna, and does it have a good future?
Well, here's the thing, Mike. Our nuclear plants are aging, but they're also like a solid tractor that works on the farm for 40 years. They're still producing. Nuclear power in the state is about 15% of the total power access that we have, but they produce 30% of our power in New York State. If you take hydropower and put it together another 20%, that's 50% of our power in New York State is non-carbon emitting right now. So we have, compared to other states that depend heavily on coal and gas and other things, we have a pretty good mix in New York State. Now, some people think we're going to have renewables, they're going to replace this right away. Wind makes up 3%. Solar makes up a minimal, not even a percent of the total. Mm-hmm. We can't flip that quickly. And so what the issue's been is nuclear power right now is at a higher cost than what some of the other things we could do to produce. Natural gas is low, and oil, very honestly, is lower than nuclear power in the cost. But we have those plants sitting there already. To just shut them down and move to something else would be, I think, ultimately we'd be using a lot more gas and oil and coal to bring the electricity to New York. I think ultimately, both for the environment and ultimately for the cost, even though it's costing us some extra right now, ultimately the better decision is to keep nuclear strong in New York, keep it a part of the mix, even though it might push up the cost to our consumers a bit right now. If we closed them, that cost is going to go up as well.
Right, you close them right now, it sounds as if the state would be scrambling to find other sources of energy to make up the difference.
Absolutely.
All right, well, that's going to, it's going to
so
be
hopefully a strong future for Ginna.
Yeah, and it sounds like an interesting situation, something the state's going to have to be dealing with in future years.
Absolutely.
All right, it's interesting. If you folks watching want to know how you can reach out to your representative, easy thing for you to do. You get a hold of Bob Oaks at his office in Lyons in the 315 area code, dial 946-5166. Send an email to oaksr@nyassembly.gov or look him up on Facebook, Assemblyman Oaks. Bob Oaks, thanks again for being here. Thank you folks, too, for spending your time with us. We'll hope to see you soon for our next edition of Assembly Calendar.